In the 1970s, antique collectors traveling through Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, came upon quilts hanging on clotheslines outside Amish homes. These quilts dated from the 1890s to 1950. They found these quilts so beautiful, so extraordinary, and in their words, so modern, they began to collect these utilitarian objects of everyday Amish life as pieces of modern art. They were extraordinary in their use of color and simplicity of design. Over time, the quilts found their way into the hands of collectors and museums. In the 1980s, books documenting these collections began to be published, showing these magnificent quilts. My name is Cindy Smith, and I've been quilting since the 1980s. It's through these books that I first fell in love with Amish quilts. The quilt you've been looking at is not an Amish quilt, but one of my Amish-inspired quilts. It's called Barred because the pattern is one of the common Amish designs, a series of bars, usually an odd number, in a center field. But the other reason it's called Barred is more elusive. According to the ordinum, or the religious rules, the Amish could use only certain patterns and colors in their quilts. Not every color was permitted. Most of the colors came from their actual clothing. With its ombre fabric and complex French braid design, surely this quilt would have been barred, hence the name. One of the things that all Amish quilts have in common is the extent of the quilting. As near as we know, the quilting itself was not regulated by the bishopric, so Amish ladies could be as creative as they wished. There would be a temptation to quilt a lot, because when ladies quilted, they were with a number of friends, and it was a very enjoyable social time. Most notable on the quilts is the presence of a feather design. The feather design is still popular today with traditional quilters, but the Amish were masters of it. You'll notice the wide borders and corner block design. Corner blocks were often seen on Amish quilts. Barred was completed this winter during quarantine. The next quilt features a modern block design by Deb Tucker of Studio 180. She calls it the Cyclone Block, so I named this quilt Lancaster Whirlwind. As you can see, it contains many of the elements of an Amish quilt, the colors, the borders, and even a central design. However, the block would not have been permitted. Fancy blocks were published in magazines and newspapers of the day and were considered worldly by the Amish, or English, and were not permitted by the church. There was one case where a woman wanted to create a quilt to celebrate Lindbergh's flight. She used the simple pattern, but it formed propellers of his plane. In order to do this, she had to get a special dispensation from the bishop. The quilting on Amish quilts was typically done with either black thread or matching color thread. While in the borders, I have used black thread on the feather motif. The rest of the pattern is quilted with a contrasting thread that blends with some of the blocks and yet stands out on others. The quilt design in the cyclone blocks is modern and is meant to mimic the whirling of the storm. You'll notice on this quilt that the blocks almost appear as if they were sitting in a field of black. That design choice harkens back to the center square design so often seen in early Lancaster quilts. The red, turquoise, and black borders, plus the purple field around the central blocks, are all Amish elements. Baby quilts were uncommon among the Amish. We're not sure why this is so, except possibly the practical Amish felt that a baby would grow out of a quilt so quickly that it might not be a profitable use of time to make such a small quilt. There are a few, and some collectors have specialized in them, but they're rare. This quilt is only 44 by 44. The 4 stars utilize a block called shaded 9 patch. As in the other quilts, it has borders and corner blocks. One of the notable things about this quilt is the quilting. It uses a very simple pattern that is known to the English as the Baptist fan, but among the Amish is called the Amish fan. It's an old and very popular pattern of nested curves and a lot of fun to do. The corner blocks have feathers. The final quilt is based on a pattern from the 1920s that was published in the Kansas Star. Right away, that tells you it was not accepted by the Amish, but it surely works with the Amish colors. This quilt for me was a development in my quilting that I did exactly what the Amish would have done and ignored the border lines of the block and simply quilted a feather wreath, crossing lines and borders. This would be a traditional way for the Amish to deal with the quilting. The spiraling feather, however, is really a modern interpretation of a feather and is done completely freehand on a long arm without a stencil. Around the feather block, you can see continuous curved blocks, which fill the areas between the blocks and make an interesting pattern of curves and points. I used a cable design that crosses both borders on the outside of the quilt. Cables were often used by the Amish in their quilting and in just the same manner as I've used it, to join two borders together as one unit. The outside border of the quilt is an interpretation of a heart and curved feathers. The Amish were famous for their curled feathers, and this freehand version echoes their original. Despite the limitations on color and design imposed by their faith, the Amish women created great beauty and stunning art. In the original quilts, you can clearly perceive the intentional design choices that these women made. That they could create such beauty while providing warmth for their family is a phenomenon still seen now among quilters. As a modern quilter, I can only hope to walk in their footsteps. Or, to borrow the words of Paul Cézanne, to my mind, one does not put oneself in the place of the past. One only adds a new link. And that is how I would like my quilts to be viewed.